everybody, and welcome to the Cinematic Schematic, the official podcast of the Cinematropolis.com. I'm your host, Caleb Masters, and today we're going to be starting with a spoiler-free review of the highly anticipated new film from Jordan Peele, Us. And then later, we're going to move into a spoiler-filled discussion and analysis segment. And joining us for the review is LaRon Chapman. LaRon, welcome back.
Hey, always good to be back.
So, of course, we're joined across the table from me by Christopher Shultz. Christopher, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be back.
And, of course, joining us again, this is what, 3 months in a row? Daniel Bokemper.
Probably, something like that. No introduction, I like.
Well, I mean, you're the associate editor here at the Cinematropolis. Sheesh, tough critics today. We're very excited to be talking about I think one that I would say probably the most anticipated horror movie of at least this year. Us, everyone I think saw Get Out, Jordan Peele's first film, and it wasn't quite a horror movie, but I think everyone's been really anxious to see what he was going to do following the critical acclaim he received from that film. So yeah, it's going to be a fun talk. Now, before we jump into our review, I want to remind our listeners out there that you can keep up with all of our work here at the Cinematropolis at thecinematropolis.com, and you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at the Cinematrop, and on Facebook at facebook.com/thecinematropolis. Christopher Shultz, you actually wrote a review and analysis for us this week that went up earlier last week, and I highly encourage listeners to check that out. I think we're going to touch on some of the ideas you wrote into the review today, but it's a great read.
Reading is good.
Reading is good. Audio is great.
It's
I want you to listen. It is fundamental.
Mm-hmm. And fun.
Fundamental. All right. Well, without further ado, let's just go ahead and jump right into our review of Us.
Can't believe how big they've got.
Did you hear Gabe got a boat?
He's kidding, right?
He's not kidding. Hey, I think it's vodka o'clock.
Oh, yeah.
Where's Jason?
Jason?
Where were you? I didn't know if you were lost. Stick with me, and I'll keep you safe.
There's a family in our driveway.
It's probably the neighbors. But y'all scared of a family? Hi, can I help you?
Zora, put your shoes on.
If you want to get crazy, we can get crazy.
So the synopsis reads, a family's serenity turns to chaos when a group of doppelgangers begins to terrorize them. Pretty vague, I think pretty accurate. Basically what the premise of the film that they spoil in the trailers.
It's kind of impossible to give just a log line for this movie.
It really is.
Because, that's the general premise, and then it goes other directions. But yes, so...
We'll just start going in a counterclockwise in a circle around the table with you, Mr. LaRon Chapman. What did you think of Us?
Coming off of my favorite movie from the year when Get Out came out, was a couple of years ago now. I
think it was 2017?
2017. I went into it, obviously, with high expectations and tried to modify them, knowing that this was a different animal. It had been, he'd said several times, it's not Get Out. It's not necessarily about race, which was very specific to Get Out. So I went into it still with pretty high expectations and left pretty satisfied. Bolder, you can see he's a little bit more confident in his direction this time around. And just a lot to chew on once you leave.
So I think one thing I take away from the film was that Get Out had one very strong core idea. Mm-hmm. And this film had, there's definitely a core idea for sure, but I think he's touching on he's working on a much grander scope with this film than Get Out. So
for sure.
A lot of really rich ideas we're going to talk about here more, especially in the spoiler section. But Christopher Shultz, what did you think of Us?
I thought it was fantastic. I had gone into it pretty blind. I hadn't even watched the trailer beforehand. So, and I would suggest that if you can do that, do it. Even if you have watched the trailer already, it doesn't really actually spoil that much. They did a good job with kind of really keeping that narrative hidden, I guess, or just suggested rather. So, but yeah, it's a wild ride for sure. And if you think you've got it figured out, you don't. So I would highly recommend it overall. It was a fantastic film. And I think one really kind of outdid himself from Get Out previously, even though they're not the same movie per se, or even that thematically related, only by a thin margin. But yeah, this one's bigger. It's grander, and all in all, it's just a really solid.
Something about the craftsmanship feels like it's a step up too. Not that, of course, Get Out, I think we all agree, was phenomenal. I think it was at least in my top 5 films that year. It was an incredible film. Obviously, huge impact. So it's not to take away from the incredible accomplishment that film was, but this Us definitely feels like a step up, specifically in the realm of horror. I don't know, something about the editing just feels sharper. The performances are stronger. Again, not to take away from anything from Us, but there's a level of sophistication I really felt was present here that wasn't also to the same degree in Get Out.
Also, there's a huge. Obviously, they gifted him with a bigger budget this time too.
Yes,
which helps. Yeah. So that's helpful.
Which, by the way, I think this movie was like $20 million.
Yeah, $20 million.
And he's by the way, we're recording this on the Sunday after the release, and it's already like.
It's about 90 million, almost 100 million.
Yeah, worldwide. 70 million in the US and 20 million internationally. So they've already made what's that, quadrupled their budget back, and this is only the first weekend. So,
which is insane. Because I think with Get Out, wasn't he the first African American male to get $100 million film? I think that was kind of the trademark that he made with that.
At least in horror, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I know this one is the highest grossing original horror of all time for the first opening weekend. The highest, it is the third highest grossing rated R horror film behind two very established franchises, last year's Halloween and then It Part 1, which It Part 1, not a franchise per se, but it's a Stephen King adaptation. It's a remake. I mean, it's not
it's a franchise of sorts. Stephen King franchise. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and Peele doesn't have the benefit of leaning on a pre-existing franchise, too. It's weird. There's this sense of, like, popular horror. We think of the horror films that have kind of, I think, composed a bit of the horror renaissance we've seen as late, which would be, like, The Witch, probably It Follows, The Babadook, films like that, but they're not...
Wait, Daniel.
They're not popular.
They're not. Those aren't horror movies. What are you talking about?
Those are psychological thriller dramas with supernatural.
I would argue they're comedies, but
with blood and gore, they're psychological thrillers meant to horrify you.
But yes,
side with Laurent. I too thought they were hilarious. But okay, either way, whatever that genre is, that definitely isn't horror. I feel like there is kind of a sense of what popular horror and what horror that exceeds on a large scale would be, and I think maybe It and Halloween, the recent iterations of that both fall into that, whereas Us doesn't, yet it still hits the proper notes. And again, to Laurent's point, it's clear that Peele he's exercising a bit more discipline, I think. Not to say he wasn't disciplined in Get Out, but there is almost like a Hitchcockian like approach to the film. There's nothing that, and we were talking a little bit before this about in one moment, still spoiler free, that a character is reading a book and we were having trouble discerning what they were reading. But like, there's nothing, I think aside from that might be one of the few exceptions. There doesn't seem to be anything that isn't deliberate within the shot. Maybe in some ways more so than Get Out. I think working against that initial film is hard for anyone to follow up. I still think he exceeds in a lot of different ways. I'm still trying to, I feel like they might be a bit incomparable in some ways try and say one's better than the other. Or
right. This is like, I think we're looking at, if you look at someone like Quentin Tarantino, you've got Reservoir Dogs being his debut film, right? And then this is kind of like the Pulp Fiction. Like, this is actually quite different, but similar at the same time. Right. And it's similar enough because you can feel the auteur's voice in the work. So it's like, on that level, you're like, okay, I'm going to compare it. But I do think these are different genres or different styles of storytelling we're seeing here. I definitely feel like the sophistications, things are a little tighter and, like you said, more intentional. The payoffs, I actually just caught this a second time, and it was amazing to me how every single scene there is in the first act is setting up something, whether it's a joke or a scare or a theme. Like, every single scene, even the really seemingly inconsequential ones, that's is very clear. Once you get to the film, that scene was meant to be there specifically so it could do something later.
And so many filmmakers will have difficulty balancing that. It kind of falls onto like, a bit condescending. Fresh off of our Glass review, I think that might be an appropriate comparison, not in that these films are comparable in any way. We were pretty negative about Glass, but M. Night Shyamalan, he doesn't trust his audience, I think, Peele both trusts his audience, but he also knows, I mean, he's very meticulous in his own craft, that he doesn't... I don't think there's a need to establish like, well, this is going to be a twist and you better be ready for it or better be anticipating it. So when it catches you off guard, I think it's all the more jarring. It's all the more resonating. Even if you do anticipate it, the way it's been, again, crafted so delicately, it still feels rewarding. There's not really any sabotaging this film. I have people in hindsight suggesting that some of the film's reveals and the turns they felt were a little bit, I feel like anybody could say that after
the fact.
Seeing if it's like really easy.
Well, it's one of those, this is a case where, and again, trying to be careful about spoilers. This is definitely a film where everything that is in the first act or throughout the film really is very intentional. And there are all sorts of cues for what's going to come planted throughout that
aren't immediately apparent until we later.
Until you have context.
They're there, but there's no context for them, so we don't know what they are. So
right, which in my mind that is part of what makes Peele a great storyteller, and I think early Shyamalan was really good at this, which is laying the groundwork for great twists and more layered story. You're so good at storytelling that the audience isn't really paying attention to those in the way that they would if they had the full context. Right. And so whenever the full context is revealed, all of a sudden you're like, well, yeah, of course, it was right there the whole time. Everything was right in front of you the whole time.
Right.
Yeah, that journey for discovery that he can do in less than 2 hours that even really good television shows take the course of 8 or 9 hours as a viewer, so many tangents, and they're all just kind of swirling into, I feel like this is leading to a toilet analogy. And I don't want it to. If it is, it's the best toilet ever, but you have all these tangents, these theories and these ideas that are swirling, and I think that's what he captures in this is like the discovery of viewing, of like that feeling of discovery, I guess, that feeling of learning in a film that I think sometimes is lost in a lot of recent, at least like really popular stuff.
The element of surprise, he's reinvigorated into the genre that I think has been missing for a while.
Right.
Exactly. It's very refreshing to see.
Well, yeah, and I think one thing you talked about, Daniel, too, that I think is really great about Peele is he knows how to balance the comedy, the drama, and the horror all so well. You never feel like you have whiplash when you're watching it, but within 2 minutes you can be funny, you can feel something for the characters, and you can also be scared all pretty quickly. And I think it's because Peele really understands his audience. He knows how to anticipate what they're going to be feeling when they watch something. So because I just feel like he has such a great control over what your expectations in the moment are going to be, even with things like jump scares. He doesn't really play. I mean, like the only times he really utilizes those are for gags. They're funny. Like they're not even really meant for scare. It's just kind of like, see, you're silly for laughing at that or being scared of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So no, I think again, I think overall this is a top notch film. I mean, this is probably my favorite film of the year so far. At least it's up there. I just got back from South by Southwest, so I have a lot of movies to digest, and there's a lot of really great ones, but this is definitely up there, if not definitively, like my favorite film of the year so far. I also want to give a huge shout out to Lupita Nyong'o, terrifically performance. I also think Winston Duke was super funny. I think, and then the child actors, of course, were all also very good, and fun. But overall, the level of quality, it just really feels like it's
elevated.
And I think a lot of it has to do with budget, because obviously he proved that he's a very good, really powerful storyteller.
But you said the caliber of the performances too, in particular. That's another thing too. Like, I mean, there was something very subdued about Get Out, the performance, and everybody was playing it very, very nuanced. And here, we have a lot of levels. In particular, you get the dual performances from each of the principal actors, and both of them giving great performance pieces on both sides of that coin, I think. So
I think there's just a lot more confidence overall too. Get Out was a bit of a risk, especially for someone coming from the world of comedy, and but it turns out to be a huge success. People are talking about best horror film of the year. It ends up winning best original screenplay Oscar. So here he is coming into this newer, bigger idea, and it's a crazier idea if you really think about it. I mean, this is kind of in a lot of ways a risky movie to make, but he's been allowed to do this, and he's got So I think that confidence is really shining through the entire, the writing of it, the filmmaking, every aspect of it, because he's a lot more trusted
for sure
to do something really wild. So
yeah. One thread that continued from Get Out that I really appreciated, it was, I think, actually a little more refined here, and I think this is something that you can really directly attribute not only to Jordan Peele's framing, but also Lupita Nyong'o's performance as a whole. The way he focuses on a face in any circumstance. Throughout Get Out, it was very prevalent, but here even more so. I feel like every major movement of the film is in a way written on Lupita's face, and it does so well. And it reminds me of a Ingmar Bergman kind of famously once mentioned in an interview, one of the most important aspects, I think, for him in filmmaking and telling a story through film is the performer's face. Like, everything you need to say can really be said without saying if it's written on a person's face. And that's an important device. So you always have these lingering shots with Max von Sydow and The Seventh Seal, The Virgin Spring. But then here I feel like and again, I think part of it is Peele knowing what he's doing, but also Lupita knowing very much what she's doing and her performance and just those isolated shots. And I mean, that's used narratively also with the lighting and you get a little bit of foreshadowing, but it just seems like the most striking images throughout this film are her face. And it goes miles in this film, especially.
Yeah. Persona, I think, would be a good correlative to this film.
Very much so.
With Liv Ullmann sort of as the Lupita of that day.
So it sounds like we all feel like Jordan Peele made the transition from his sort of social thriller, I think is what he called it, to horror. Do we agree? Do you want to see him do more horror films? Do you want to see him do more kind of Twilight Zone-y films like Get Out? Like, what do you think?
For me personally, I feel like what he's done for the horror genre with these two films is really exciting. He's kind of bringing about another transformative, era for horror, where he's taking, the genre and he's using it to say something, because a lot of times if you watch a lot of horror films, sometimes from a purely craftsmanship level, they're done well. They don't always have something to say. Not always. You have the great filmmakers do, but here, he's taking very, very entrenchant, ideas, and he's using the genre and the tropes and all of the things that we're familiar with, and he's putting it into a new context for us, and he's opening it up for a discourse about larger ideas. And I find that to be the most fascinating thing, particularly like with Get Out, where he wanted to have a conversation about race, and so he made his own version of the Stepford Wives or the Body Snatcher movie, and things that seemed really familiar as it was going along, but as you see it in the context of what he's saying, it becomes something more unique and profound. So
he is probably the best at, or one of the best at least recently, of illustrating an allegory. And I think with Get Out, there's, like, I guess with Get Out, microaggressions. Very hard to, if somebody's not entirely aware of what they are, it's very hard to describe those or explain those to somebody. But I think Get Out, in a lot of ways, with The Sunken Place, it's a very specific, easy example to grab onto. And I think Us has that as well. I think the difference between Get Out and Us is Us almost feels like this, like, it really felt like kind of watching a piece of like American folklore just unfold right in front of us, and I have a feeling it's going to be kind of embedded in that way. So they are working towards two different things, but I feel like this film actually, and not to take away from Get Out at all either, but I feel like this is like some kind of like classic piece of cinema. Like, I feel like this, and Get Out will be too, but like I don't know. I just felt like we were watching something a bit like historic in a way that isn't quite as maybe derivative as, even though it clearly pulled from a lot of influences, I think maybe he did lean on some of his influences a bit more in Get Out, whereas Us, he wielded them in a way that he was able to kind of make his own, kind of forge his own path, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely a movie of the times, like right now,
Right.
without just sort of like beating you over the head with it.
Yeah.
You don't like, if you want to just appreciate it for the story aspect of it and you don't want to pay attention to I mean, that's your problem, that's your prerogative, you can do that, that's fine. But, you know, that stuff is there.
Yeah.
And so, but I think that's the best. That's the best way to sort of approach these things is to, and you know, it's not to say that Get Out was terribly heavy-handed either, because it wasn't, but it was very direct in what it was about. And this one it's about so many things. It's got so many different layers to it, and when you really finally get to the end of it and you sort of understand everything that you've watched in a sort of cumulative sense, then you really do sort of understand that how a movie like this could get made right now. And I think that when we do look back at it and we look at sort of the films that were in response to the political climate that we're in at the moment, this is going to be one of those that is very much heralded as, you know, here's a movie that really kind of had its finger on the pulse of what was going on at the time without, again, being terribly heavy-handed about it.
I don't think it's heavy-handed in any way. I mean, I think Get Out was a lot more direct with its message. And I mean, I think that the ideas that Peele was wrestling with here, I mean, without getting too spoilery, but I think it's okay to talk about some themes like the idea of the greatest fear is being found out that, you know, you're a fraud, or that, you know, being found out that the self you show the world is not who you really are. I think that it works on a micro level there, but I think it's also at least touching on a lot of much larger themes about like what it means to be an American, and what this sort of like loss of identity in American culture that can be traced back to the Reagan era 80s, I think is all really fascinating. And we're going to talk more about those in spoilers, but I think it's fair to say that there are a number of really great things working here, both on a macro, very high, big picture scale, grand scheme, like what is America, but also on an independent level, I think. Dealing with psychology and dealing with people trying to figure out who am I really and what are we really afraid of as a culture. I think this movie is really exploring those questions in really interesting ways, really effective and entertaining ways. So, well, let's go ahead and move into our recommendation piece here before we get into the spoilers. So, how would we rate and recommend this film for our listeners? Daniel, we'll start with you and go around the table.
Pirate it as soon. No, I'm just kidding. I wouldn't say that for any film we recommend, but for this one, I would say see it immediately. Pay full price. Pay the $38 balcony.
Well, $38 balcony.
Is that not how much it is?
It's like $15-16.
Really?
Yeah, but then if you get food,
if you get like beer and a steak
Yeah.
dinner, which you do in the balcony,
like 8 beers is mandatory.
Dude, those beers are like for it's like $9 for anyway. Never mind. So apparently, go spend your entire paycheck on Us at the balcony and whatever your local theater balcony is. Christopher Shultz, how would you recommend the film?
I mean, you know, I don't care how much you pay to see it, but I would say see it in the movie theater because there are some shots in there that having it on the big screen, especially when you get towards the end of the film, that like it's not going to take away from it to see it on like a small screen at home for the first time necessarily, but seeing these shots on a big screen like that is so effective and profound. So yeah, definitely experience it in the movie theater.
I think the audience interaction is a lot of fun too, right?
So long as they don't think everything in the movie is funny, like the screen that we were at, but
people were laughing at literally everything.
Literally everything.
Everything.
There's a family in the driveway, and they burst out in the laughter.
That's what I was.
That's funny.
Definitely see it with an audience, just not ours. So
it's not the one we watched
just
it with.
The one we watched it with. No, because I think that the audience engagement is it's a big integral part of the experience of it too. It's kind of your barometer for how the scares and the laughs are kind of landing. Because it was interesting to see a lot of the nervous laughter and how he's infusing dark humor, satire, whatever, with really genuinely terrifying moments, and sometimes simultaneously, like they're happening in the same moment where we're laughing and we're also in a really tense mood. So it's a really nice balance that is really difficult to find in horror movies because it's normally one thing or the other. So I say see it in the theater.
Yeah, I say absolutely see it in the theater. I saw it in a Dolby screening, which might seem like overkill, but it wasn't, because that soundtrack, when that soundtrack and the bass drops, it's awesome.
Yeah,
it's worth it. And of course, I think this is going to be one that you're going to want to purchase when it eventually makes its way to home video. But yeah, I think for the reasons Chris said, that the power of the image, I think the close-ups of the face, like Daniel mentioned, there's a lot of that, and I think, of course, it's going to be even more effective on the big screen. There's some really great work with Lupita Nyong'o, and I think seeing that on the big screen, seeing that work up close, really adds to the impact. So I think, seeing it in the theater is going to be a huge benefit to you, but also you're going to want to buy it and watch it on this big screen. I do think, Daniel, you're onto something. I feel like, Get Out was certainly popular. It made tons of money, and I think it really just hit on an idea that people could relate to, especially in the political climate and era we're in America. But I think this movie has the potential to catch on into the zeitgeist and become like an iconic horror film of some sort, like a John Carpenter's Halloween or something. Maybe not to that degree, but you know what I mean? I feel like this could be one, like 20 years from now, we're still making jokes about this movie.
It's a moment. It's a moment in the horror genre for sure. It's hard to think of anything that's like it, really. Nothing comes to mind right in this moment. So
yeah, it's such a combination of different, like there's little things that we've seen before,
right?
But it's all sort of blended into a way that is really nothing we've seen before.
Yeah, I know. You know what? And honestly, on that note, before we move into spoilers, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I'm not gonna lie. When I was watching it, we had the screener. The first half of the film, it wasn't that I didn't like it, but I was having a hard time like getting on the wavelength of the film. Obviously I got the comedy, but I was like, all right, where's this movie going? Mm-hmm. Like it took me a good like hour for me to really like latch. And it's not that I knew where it was going exactly, but before I was able to like hop on the ride and be like, all right, this is the kind of movie I'm watching.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't play into the horror tropes like you'd expect it to. I don't really feel like it's like playing within a formula. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like it was consistently keeping me on my toes in those early. Yeah. At least in the first act, of the film, where I was like, all right, so where's this movie going? What kind of horror movie are we watching? Right. And then, I don't know, something clicked. We'll talk about it in spoilers. Something clicked, and I was like, all right, I'm with the movie now. It's great.
It like conjures convention, but it doesn't rely on any kind of convention. And I think that's a pretty important distinction between this and, I don't know, even like I'm thinking of, as much as I liked the most recent Halloween, it still does kind of play into Halloween being a somewhat more conventional horror film. It I don't know, it kind of, I could see that film maybe relying on that a little bit more. Maybe even it as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think it and Halloween are both very conventional.
Exactly. Yeah. Like,
they're good, but they're definitely, when you watch those films, you kind of, even though they're doing fresh things, you still, whenever you're watching those, I don't know, it's easy to kind of get a feel for where you're at in the movie. Generally, kind of where's this movie heading? What are the plot beats going to look like? I didn't feel that way with Us at all, and it's kind of fun. It's kind of fun to watch a horror movie where you have no idea what's going to happen next. If you gentlemen don't have anything else left to add, let's go ahead and move on to our spoilers section.
Hey, has anybody seen that new Russell Crowe thriller? Because let me tell you,
sorry, it's just we're going tomorrow, and I don't want to know a thing about it.
She doesn't want to know a thing. Gotcha. Okay. All right.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So good though.
Who won the game?
I think that it was.
That I'm gonna watch it later.
All right, so once again, I want to remind you that we are now going to be talking about spoilers. So if you haven't seen the movie, stop and go watch the movie. We all told you to go see the movie in the theater, so stop.
Get out.
Yeah.
This is for us, not you.
So stop and go watch the movie and come back. Yeah, this is for us. Really. You guys can listen too.
Right.
And I'm sure listeners out there are going to have some observations of their own they'd like to share. But let's go ahead and just throw out the big twist, which is that Adelaide. Is it?
Adelaide.
Adelaide was the entire film was actually the clone of herself. At the kind of in the prologue of the film, we see the younger version of herself go to the carnival, walk down the extremely creepy Hall of Mirrors. Guys, that was terrifying. Halls of Mirrors are always scary.
Yeah.
It's awful. And we see her, she encounters the clone of herself. And then we don't find out until the end of the film that actually the clone knocked her unconscious, dragged the real Adelaide downstairs, and then returned to her parent, the non-clone parents.
Right.
And then
is mute essentially.
Yes.
And they knew something traumatic happened to her in that space, but never were able to explain it, and it seems to have carried over into her adulthood.
And apparently, and this is where it's a little unclear and I think a little ambiguous, and I think intentionally so, is how much she remembered.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, because we don't get the reveal as the audience until the very end of the film.
Right.
But there's kind of this moment on her face where seems like she's realizing it, but I don't know, man. Because at the beginning of the film, when you're watching it, she's the moment her husband brings up Santa Cruz, she's like, I don't want to go there. I want to go there. And it's because, and even later she talks to him and says, I'm just afraid this double of myself that I encountered as a kid was real and she's going to come back to get me, you know. And he's all like, oh no, it was a long time ago, you don't remember it, yada yada. And but no, I mean, I think either consciously or subconsciously she did know that she wasn't really her, and that she knew there was another her out there that could just show up at any moment.
Yeah.
I go back and forth, and I'm still not really sure. One thing I think is telling, which might reveal that she remembers all of it, and that she's literally just trying to preserve her staying on the surface, essentially, is the way that she interacts with Red, who is her double, and the way that, like, when Red is there's a moment where she's telling the kids to run. She's telling Adelaide's kid to run, and her children, the doubles of Adelaide's children, are going to chase them. And the way in which Adelaide is just sort of like, it's okay. She like trusts them that they're going to be able to take care of themselves. But all the while she's trying to sort of keep the upper hand with that situation. There's something about the way that she interacted with Red that made me think in retrospect that maybe she does know the entire time. And all of it is about self-preservation. Yeah. Not just of saving her family, but of, maintaining her status.
Okay. And this just to keep it clear, this you're referring to the switched version of her, or Red herself, which you're talking about Adelaide. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So Red obviously knows.
Right.
So it's confusing. So to clarify, Red is actually the original Adelaide.
That was switched at a very young age.
Yes.
So yeah,
she's one of the Adelaide is one of the tethered. Originally.
Right.
Tethered.
Yeah.
Right.
Which, by the way, that's kind of crazy. The whole we'll get into that in a second.
Yes. That's another thing.
That's like deep. That's like deep cut sci-fi type tropes, and I loved it. I loved that it feels like its own little weird. It's a whole other movie about where these tethered came from, and
there's a world building example.
We just scratched the surface of it,
right? And I did get a little worried there when they did start to elaborate fully on what was going on. I knew it was coming anyway, but that's the always I gravitate far more to horror that just doesn't. It's also a bit alienating sometimes when you don't have that elaboration, and you wonder how, as a filmmaker, can you make that still hit properly. And I think this film found a really, really, really nice balance for that. It definitely like just gives you enough. Again, there's like this implication that like I think Peele actually joked on it in an interview with Polygon. He was like, oh, maybe we'll have an us verse or something like that. I kind of hope he does. Like, I just, for the sake of knowing where franchises sometimes go, we're in a different era now. So,
well, technically, this is property of Universal. So,
exactly, yeah. So, I'm like, but it's
them will be next.
Them, yeah. Then you.
It's just the same movie. I mean,
we comes out. I don't know. But it's enough to just let it work. Like you ask, like, well, why does this exist? Why were there a bunch of clones under the like?
I think he did a good job at not over explaining it. I think we get just enough. There's a lot of ambiguity enough for him to not have to explain the rules, but he explained that this was a thing that had happened.
Well, and the explanation that we get is Red's interpretation of what she thinks.
Right.
Fair.
And so again, it's like, well, but maybe that's not why this thing that sounds logical. And Red is, because Red came from the surface. It was the original Adelaide was not born in this lab. Yeah. She's obviously much smarter, so she's able to sort of observe and deduce what's happening with this. And but again, that's speculative. That's as much as she's been able to figure out. It sounds logical enough, and it makes a lot of sense in terms of the thematics of the film. But that's all we get, and I think the explanation is perfect. It's just enough to sort of ground us and make us understand and understand the film further. But it's not so much where we're literally spending 15 minutes trying to explain this backstory,
which is like hard to do with like a doppelganger film. Like I can't. This is probably the best doppelganger of the ones I can think of, like doppelganger film, and the ones I think of that are really good. Sometimes they're like very distantly, like The Thing. That it explains itself quite a bit to try and
it's just from space.
Exactly. Yeah, that's pretty much all you need to know. And that
Invasion of the Body Snatchers, they're from space.
Exactly. Yeah. And Enemy. Nothing. We're never going to elaborate on it. Right. Just take it and that. It
well, I think that I don't think the where they come from is really the point of the story here. I think thematically, I think it's always when you're using a doppelganger, it's almost always the thematics that end up being the more important piece here. Which, yes, it's fun to speculate on where this might have came from, but I just think it really plays really well into the theme that Adelaide's greatest fear is having to confront her real self,
right?
And or that she'll be discovered by her family that she's not really who she says she is, which I think works on a really great micro level. And then they blow that same idea up on the macro level with the whole like channeling, the whole like holding hands across America, which I didn't realize was a real
ad.
Maybe showing how young I am. I had no idea that was a thing that happened. I was like, I think I'd seen that imagery before, but I didn't know that was literally a thing that they attempted to do in the 80s.
How far did they get? How many miles was
so it was stupid because it was never really intended to be like literally like people forming a human chain across America. It was symbolic. Maybe some people in a small town or something will like all stretch across the town. I don't know how successful it was. I remember it happening when I was in grade school. I think we went out to the playground and held hands for a while, and then that was, at the designated
time. We're holding
time.
Hands right now.
We're all just holding hands right now and being silent for 10 minutes. So,
well, I like that that's based on young Adelaide, who the real Adelaide, who went on to become Red. That was how she envisioned like a world takeover was. We're actually, because based on the images she saw when she was a small child, which I think is kind of a funny little touch. That I think a funny way to use nostalgia to support the themes of the film, which is a lot of people who were around at the time looking at that whole like weird 80s era.
And the ad that they show, and I don't know if that was an actual ad or if that was produced for the movie specifically, but the ad is just painting it as like, this is going to be, the most magical, like all Americans coming together, joining hands, making a statement. And so for her then to have been, literally chained up below the surface for decades.
And wasn't the intent of this to build world hunger?
It's like raising awareness about world hunger. It was.
So there's obviously a commentary here on privilege and class too, because obviously they're much more marginalized at the bottom,
right?
And they don't have as many resources.
Well, and the Hands Across America definitely gets criticized as being just sort of like an empty gesture. It's like, okay, everyone got together and held hands, but like, what did that solve?
What did that solve? Yeah,
people are still hungry,
right? Right.
So it's always sort of been criticized as like, this is sort of like white privilege version of raising awareness,
right? Like the modern equivalent of the oh God, was like posting on Instagram when you're in it. Like,
the changing your profile picture to
the ice bucket challenge.
Or like ice bucket challenge.
How many people donated, or did they just throw buckets of ice on their head just because it was fun? But,
so it is interesting that she takes that and says, okay, well, we're going to actually do this, one, and two, we're going to do it in a way that like is actually meaningful. We're going to achieve this thing that never actually happened on the surface, but it's going to be an actual statement. And they do that. The final shot that I alluded to earlier that you'll want to see on the big screen is the camera pans up to show just like a hillside, and there's like 3 helicopters in the air just like observing it, and it's just this endless row of the tethered in their
holding hand on mountains all the way through
to the horizon,
to far as you can see.
It's amazing, and it's like, wow, this they pulled this thing off. This is huge. It didn't just happen to this family. It didn't just happen in this town.
That was the most fascinating thing about this, because the way Us is advertised, it feels like it's going to be a home invasion movie with these 4 doppelgangers, and we very quickly, as you mentioned, it took you about an hour to finally, where is it going? Once we got to the neighbor's house, and saw that there were doppelgangers of them as well, then it's like, okay, wait, now I feel like it just broadened.
The scope is much bigger than we
It's not
expected.
Self-contained with these people. There may not even. It's a bigger message about a lot of things. So
and when the home invasion happened so soon, I was legitimately like, I wasn't confused. That's something I was expecting to happen later in the film, even. Like,
just building to that.
This was the home invasion was the inciting incident, not the climax.
Exactly,
which is I was expecting it to be the climax. So when it was happening earlier, I was like, "Whoa, this is actually not just a home invasion film. Like the home invasion is just a small piece of the bigger story." So it wasn't. And again, I think it's super effective.
Right.
But it was one of those when I was watching, I was like, "Oh, okay, hold on, I gotta get readjusted here." And it consistently did that in the first act, where it constantly is kind of playing with conventions a little bit, and really keeps you on your toes as to like what exactly you're watching and what the goals of the story are, because it's clear like whenever they get out of the house, I want to say 30 minutes into the film, maybe 45 minutes, and they're on their boat, you're like, where are we going now? Like is
this where it ends? Is this where it is? Like, it felt like you were,
because we know how home invasion films work, and we know we know that there's like probably like 3 or 4 different ways they can actually end, and when it doesn't. And when the first act ends with them getting away, you're like, okay, so now we're moving on to a bigger story that Jordan Peele's telling, and I can't wait to see where it goes. And that's where and it wasn't that I was trying to figure it out; it was I was trying to find my footing. But once I kind of realized that I was watching something totally unlike anything, I was like, all right, I am on the ride.
Let me just watch where it goes.
Right, I just want to see where it goes. Yeah. And because where we're going, I feel like is somewhat uncharted, and it's great. It feels remarkably fresh. And it kind of takes me to another theme that I touched on about the idea of like America and how this might be wrestling with the identity crisis within America. And I just want to see what your take is, because I actually don't have any I've been chewing on this. I'm like, I don't really know exactly what he's getting at fully. But, in her monologue, her first monologue, Red says, when they're asking her questions, she says, why? And she says, well, we're Americans. So it clearly, and then obviously the idea of the 1980s Americana they show on the TV, and the fact that she latched onto that commercial, I think those are all very intentional choices. So do you guys think that Jordan Peele is trying to say anything in particular about America specifically, or is this just more of like a set dressing or scene setting?
I mean, without being fully confident in it, because it is a little vague, is the thing I kind of took away from it was that they are the tethered are looking for their iteration of what they see the American dream to be, that the people on top seem to be lavishing in. And so it's like, who's to say that they aren't as entitled to it as other people are, which could also be a larger commentary on like foreigners coming into our country, and how we say like, no, they're not, they can't come in here. And it's like, well, why are we privileged to have these things and they aren't? We all share this space, and so, but everyone has their own idea for why, who gets what things, what resources are, we should have. but then also just like the fear of the other or the fear of the foreigner, just feels very much like, that's what the tethered to me kind of represented, at least in my interpretation of it. But
yeah, and the fear of looking into yourself sometimes too. And I think especially with America, when I was watching the film and started to it is distant. It's specific and it's vague enough. It's not specific to the point of where you're going to be able to nail down a precise meaning. Maybe more in line with like Get Out. There was a little bit of a more specifics at what he was getting at. Well, way more. And in this, as we were mentioning earlier, it's a bit broader. He's kind of his horizon. It's harder to pin down. But even then, there's this idea that where America is built on a history of violence, on a history of injustice, on a history of the privileged continuing to be the privileged. And we don't look at ourselves too often. I think I don't think America as a whole really looks and sees what that violence means. I mean, for us in Oklahoma, we don't really like modern Oklahoman textbooks. They've only just now started to consider like the implications of the Tulsa race riots, if at all. And they're not really riots.
Like super recently,
very recently, and like the Tulsa basically race massacre. Like
even the fact that they're referred to as riots,
exactly, that is a problem.
Very telling, very telling. Yeah,
there are pieces of the American past that we don't.
We sweep under the rug, essentially, literally here. Let's just not talk about that experiment we did, that horrible thing we did.
They'll just be there, and it'll still be there. And we know
it's like the dark secret
will be there, exactly. But we just won't talk about. Like we'll just ignore it and hope that this never comes back and bites us in the ass and forms a giant line of people holding hands across America in any way. Like but I think of that. Like I think it's like this idea that to look in yourself. And again, the doppelganger narrative works so well for that. And what I was getting at a little bit when mentioning maybe it's not so important where they come from or what their origin is or what their meaning. Right, it isn't. But the idea that they're literally these people that have been built under America to rise up and make you literally look at yourself. And that builds into other things too, like when you get to the first family. I think you see it initially with like when
I mean they're I think they're painted very intentionally to be like the definition of privilege. I mean you've got Elizabeth Moss is drinking her third glass of wine in the beach, talking about her plastic surgery.
Even when the dualism, the dualism that he's constantly evoking. One shot that sticks out to me a lot is when there's that plastic toy spider, and then you have an actual spider kind of slowly creep out from under it within its own shadow. That's one moment that means a lot to me. But even maybe kind of humorously is when Gabe pulls the crawdaddy or the crawdad, the boat he has, and then it's right next to Josh and Kitty's boat. The what was it? It was like the B yacht, like the biatch, but it was like the B, and it's clearly just like a little more souped up, nicer boat, clearly, and you get that moment of
is that aspect of keeping up with the Joneses too. That you see this, like the Wilson family, Gabe in particular, is very keen on keeping up with Josh and Kitty. And he's talking about their car, and he's like, I bet he bought that car just to spite me, right? And then later on when it's they've had to dispatch the doubles of this family, and I think it's the daughter says, I guess that means we get to take their car now, and Gabe is just sort of like,
it's a great moment.
Yeah, that's true. This is horrible, but that's true. And so it doesn't really stop. Even though they're in this horrifying situation, he's still got a lot of envy about what these people have and what he does not have.
Well, it's really funny whenever they find out the scope of all the horrors. He's really Gabe is really like, we've got everything we need right here. We've got a generator. We got the TV, and then Adelaide is like, yeah, that worked out so well for our friends who were all literally like laying dead in the house.
Mm-hmm. And yet he's right at the same time, to a degree. I mean, I think, Red and the rest of them would eventually caught up. I mean, they eventually do when they're trying to leave. But that's another thing that makes me wonder about Adelaide. Like, does she remember? Does she know? Is she trying to find Red so that she can kill her so that her secret doesn't get out?
Yeah. I'm not going to quote any kind of like cognitive, research into like cognition, especially childhood cognition, but I do feel like it's not a coincidence that like ages 6 is kind of the idea where he decided to start with his character. Like it because you do, I at least remember quite a bit, all of the very most like important parts of being a 6-year-old, I think. And I think that's right at the point. I think it's also why I like Linklater's Boyhood. Doesn't it start at age 6?
I believe so.
Yeah. 6 or 7.
I think there's an important piece of that. I don't know if it does again play into any kind of like cognitive research or there's a
what's those formative years between like ages of like 5 and 8.
Yeah, I think maybe your memories maybe that's when they start to kind of get going in a bit more of a tangible way.
It confuses the performance too, because like she gives us a very earnest performance, as Adelaide, and so once that initial reveal is, then you're questioning every nuance of every moment that she was in. It was like, how well did she play this? Because then it's like, who are we supposed to root for here? And it makes that ending so fascinating.
Well, and I think too, there's that moment where and the first time I was when she runs out she gets out of the car after they fling the Red's daughter off of the car into the woods. And the first time I was watching it, I was like, why are you running into the woods to go check it, to confirm the kill? I'm like, you don't do that. That's a bad horror movie. That's like going against horror movie rules. And until the end of the film, I thought that was the dumbest thing. Why? I didn't understand why she did that. And it's something like that. It's not super clear if it's because she feels bad for her, if she wants to confirm the kill, or if she does remember that she is, the clone. Mm-hmm. There is that connection she has to that child to some degree that she knows that she shares that kinship with, and that's a moment where I'm like, I feel like she knew, because why else would she get out of the car and go into the woods to do that?
On a deep, like subconscious level, maybe perhaps too, if not fully conscious. But there's and especially because she just literally stands there and watches her die. She doesn't try to dispatch her any further. And there's this care that's on her face. There's this feeling of like, I'm sorry that this has had to happen.
Somewhat nurturing, it does feel like a mom moment.
Does she kind of calm her by saying like, that she's like, shush? I can't remember. Does she shush her or something? Okay, she just stands there. Okay.
Yeah. So no, I think, Daniel, going back to your analysis there about how the film is demonstrating how America is built off of privilege. I like that. I think that he's definitely really diving into this idea that what lies beneath is eventually going to emerge in one way or another. It could be violently, as in this film. Right. And in America that could mean a number of different things, but I think the idea of surface dwellers in general is a privilege. And in the same way that all of the lavish wealth even middle class Americans have over people, a lot of people specifically right now, people from outside of the country or people of color, people who have been subjugated through history. I mean, there's a lot of talk about reparations right now. These are all things that I think they're not, I don't think Peele is ever speaking directly to, but I think the idea of this underclass rising up and making a statement violently that's what it takes for them to get the attention they need to say that we are human too, right?
No, right. It's very telling that the narrative begins in the 80s, like right in the middle of the 80s. Because you notice it does, when we flash forward, it doesn't say, 40 years later, 30 years later, or whatever. It just says present day. Mm-hmm. And so the technology is recognizable as what we have, today, right now. But, years down the line, when we watch this film again, we're not going to see it as being set necessarily in 2019. What stands out is that it starts in the 1980s and then it goes forward to here's where we are now. And the 80s are significant because of Reagan and trickle down economics. And literally what we have in this film are people on the surface and their actions and everything that they do trickling down to these people underground. And the most telling part of that is when she wins, Adelaide wins the Thriller t-shirt, or her dad wins the Thriller t-shirt for her. And then when we see later those actions being mirrored underground, and he's got the t-shirt, but it's not the Thriller t-shirt. It's been like painted or something to almost look like the Thriller t-shirt that she won, but it's very clearly this bad sort of reproduction of it. And the face that he makes too, like the dad above ground is kind of like grinning and showing her the shirt like, hey, yeah, and he's making the same face, but it's just this grimace down below, and it looks horrifying.
Well, and also that the something that stood out to me, looking at it through that lens is you have all the people eating the carnival food, and then below ground, they're all eating rabbit. Like, it's like, yes, the psychological effects are trickling down. Yes, they are tethered, but they're getting like the subpar, scraps.
Yeah. And not just rabbit too, by the way, living live rabbits that they are tearing into and eating raw. And we're hearing the screaming of these rabbits as this is happening. It's so horrifying. But it's absolutely right. It's, these are people who have basically been left to die. And this is the only food source that they have are these rabbits. They don't really know how to cook. They just eat them raw. Yeah. They're getting the bottom of the barrel. And that was essentially what trickle down economics was. The wealth, keep their wealth, and whatever happens to trickle down.
Right, and they're also still tethered, right? They're still tethered. You're still trying to mirror the actions of the privileged people at top, right? You're still trying to maintain that same,
because you can pull yourself
up
up by your bootstraps if you work hard enough.
Yeah, if you work hard enough, you can become untethered. I mean, I guess Red is a case of that, right?
Yeah. You too can.
You too can create an entire uprising, and
But it is interesting because our empathy for her character goes so far, with the Adelaide, and then once we realize that she's not who she is, then it's still kind of hard to immediately just adopt Red's cause, because there's a confusing like tension there with those two.
Well, what I find interesting is I feel like we can empathize with the clones, though. I mean, for the reasons we just talked about, after you see where they come from, these are people that are just, I mean, I guess one could argue, are they people, right? But I mean, they are essentially people who are created and they're just an afterthought, not seen as people. Again, dehumanized. Again, ties into the privileged position of like, it doesn't really matter where they came from. Scientists at some point, probably like in the 70s and 80s, started cloning people, and we're like, you know what? They're just going to die. If we just leave them here, they're going to die on their own anyway, so we'll just abandon it.
Yeah, and the reason Red gives is like in the scientist, which is just funny, I think they tether scientists to this idea of the soul. Well, we decided we just couldn't replicate a soul. And like questioning what the soul is and what does that even mean for the purpose of this? Like clearly, like it maybe is it's weird that I don't know. It's such a funny idea that they like. Again, in a way that America probably does invest a lot of money into ideas that don't really pan out or might ultimately become vestigial. I think of like a lot of the ghost towns around America that were once like mining or something like that. We have one in Oklahoma, Pitcher, where we were like mining like limestone and things like that, and ultimately was very radiated, and so nobody's allowed in there basically to live anymore. And I think of this idea that we just like, we can't, like something as distant as a soul, like we just decided that we can't recreate that, so let's just
it's ironic because Red is actual Adelaide,
exactly,
who does have a soul for all intents and purposes
very much
as
so.
we define it, but then she's swapped out for the one that air quotes doesn't have a soul, but then we have later in the film she has more definitive as we would define personhood in our world, she has more of the traits of a quotes person than the original Adelaide, who went to go live with the clones, right? So then you start getting into I think you get into some really deep, interesting territory there about what is a human soul. Like, how do you define what is that successful look like?
Right, and I think it goes to Peele's credit about how he builds his like nemesis, and Chris was getting at it just a moment ago with like the Adelaide's father, like down below, her doppelganger father down below, who's making like the weird, peculiar smile. And then you have the shirt and like, even I think this is almost epitomized when you get to the the Wilson. I guess is it the Wilsons their last time? I can't remember. But
the Wilsons.
Yeah, and you have like Tim Heidecker, who I
by the way, shout out to him. He's not in it very much, but when he is, he gets he steals some scenes. My favorite is when whenever the clone him reaches down to help up, and then he does the whole with the hair.
Well, that's my thing, and he's clearly a goofball that entire film. And Elizabeth Moss even, where she earlier she's mentioning at one point in the film, I had some work done. Can you tell? And like I couldn't in the I don't know what she was getting at, and I think that was kind of the nature of it in that film. And then later when she recreates it to a very grotesque extent and carves her own face, but with Josh, especially your doppelganger Josh, the whole he's still a goofball. He's still
they still have aspects
sadistic,
of those personalities, right? Yeah.
Exactly, and that's an interesting how those were kind of.
I think that's the most curious thing, and the most interesting thing about this is because Red speculates that the clones were made to control the population above as like puppets somehow, and it didn't work because we see that all they do is mimic the people above. So no, they can't make an action that the people above will then mimic. It's the other way around, and yet. When the originals die, we see the Josh and Kitty and their family. They are slaughtered by the tethered instantly, and they keep going, and they have aspects of they repeat actions that happened above ground before, or like personality traits of their doubles. But now that they're dead. The originals, quote unquote, are dead. It's like, well, they just kind of keep going. And so it's clear that that one does not need the other to survive. But then, so again, what are they? What do they know about themselves? Are they conscious of themselves? Clearly they're conscious enough that they can go out and do this. Red has convinced them to do this. So it is very fascinating to wonder, just what are these creations? Are they just simply clones? Are they people? What are they doing? But the scene you're talking about where she starts carving into her own face with the scissors because, well, this lady, the lady that I was connected to, that's what she did. She carved into her face and smiled a lot.
Right.
And so she's just sitting in front of a mirror, just carving her own face with the scissors and then smiling and then carving her face some
Well, it's
more.
after she puts makeup on too.
Yeah, she does. She puts some makeup on. So she's just
creepy scene.
Very creepy scene. But what's interesting too is that she has the perfect opportunity to kill Adelaide and she doesn't. She can't kill her and then goes back to the vanity mirror and starts carving herself again. And I'm still not quite sure what that means. Why she found that she couldn't kill Adelaide.
Did she know that was a friend? Did she know that?
Yeah,
it's kind of weird.
Did she recognize her as a tethered? Is there some rule that she can only kill her counterpart or doppelganger? What? How do they work?
Right. You're starting to get into very messy territory, though, because then you start to get to some rule explaining, and I was actually really glad the movie did not get that.
I think it is great that ultimately we don't have the answers because we can kind of speculate. But that is part of what makes this film so great is that there's so many questions that you have about, well, how did the tethered work? How much are they aware of what they do? Right.
One thing that really stands out to me is the music too. It's particularly the lyrical music, like the really excellent use of the Beach Boys' "Good Vibration." That was fantastic. Wow. And then also I got 5 on it, how they're playing it multiple times.
Yeah.
Once the family's kind of playing it in the car, but then it's played again, a very stripped down, more symphonic version of it. At the end when Red is mirroring that dance there in the classroom was so fast. It's really.
I love that. The editing in that scene was fantastic too.
Yeah.
And so one of my friends mentioned, and I'm glad you brought up that scene when they're in the car, LaRon, and she's trying to Adelaide is trying to coax Jason into kind of getting into the music.
The rhythm, yeah.
Okay, there was something weird about that scene to me. She was off, and I was just kind of attributing it to maybe it's how you coax a child to start to kind of maybe get into the rhythm, actually participate in some kind of music or musical activity. But she was off. Her snapping was not consistent with the actual beat. And I'm I don't know, when you find out that reveal that it isn't her, it's was that is that
I think it was. Yeah, I think that was like she's just enough offbeat that you're going, what is going on here? Like,
because even when they're mirroring the dances between the two of them, she really wanted to do that, and then you realize, what, she gave it up at some point. She mentions, like, do you ever think you want to dance again? Elizabeth Moss asked her that on the beach, and it's like she never really fully, consummated that profession the way that Red seems to have continued passionately doing, so that was interesting.
I do think, and where a lot of maybe horror or maybe even thriller films of this genre do fail, where this film really, and I was curious what you all thought about when the final physical confrontation between Red and Adelaide, this idea of Red walking very calmly, evading Adelaide for the most part, and Adelaide just like desperately swinging at her with like was it the scissors or was it a knife of some kind? She had like a fire poker.
That's it. Fire poker. Yeah.
I just thought of like every slasher film where like the
phallic object.
Right. Well,
that the final girl has to use. Yeah.
Well, that too, but it was weird because Red is evading Adelaide in the same way maybe Jamie Lee Curtis would be evading Michael Myers. Like, she was dodging him. She was evading damage. But you have the Adelaide, who I guess is the original Red, actually being in a way, the slasher like villain, kind of fulfilling that role. And it was a way where he like twisted convention a little bit, because it's almost like, well, that seems like a weird reversal to see played out on screen. You see the one who, the protagonist attacking the horror antagonist in a way that's kind of reminiscent of like every slasher film we've seen. But then when you find out that she is Red, she is in a way the right. Tethered, ultimately the original Tethered. I just feel like that's another allusion to that possibility, like,
right.
And it he does that so frequently throughout the film. And
something that just occurred to me, Red when they're showing the flashback and like she's dancing, and when Red dances below the surface and everyone gathers and watches her, she says that she saw God in that moment, and that's when she knew that she should be the leader and that she should take these people and bring them up to the surface to rise up. And then she says to Adelaide, and just to think, if you had never danced, I would never have danced either. So what that clearly shows is that when Adelaide is dancing on the surface above, she's controlling what Red is doing, but they're switched. So
right, they're tethered either way. So I mean, I guess theoretically it did work, right?
Yeah, but only now that they have switched. Now, who's ever on the surface is the one who has the control,
right?
And I think that's the realization that she had. So that further makes me understand why they want to come up to the surface, because of vengeance to a degree, because of it's the Goonies line, "It's our time up here," that is repeated, but also that like they have control in the surface. So
and it's great that they use a dancer, like the act of like a ballerina for that metaphor. I thought of like Black Swan, and there was like a deleted piece of dialogue in that film where it's just, but it felt like a little heavy handed, where it was like the dance, the class master, whoever it is, and Black Swan is telling Natalie Portman's Nina, like, every other profession, a writer, a filmmaker, even anyone, they have things that are a little bit more immortalized, but the like dancer's art is momentary. But in that moment, it is your moment, and you own it. And I that just seems so like for like a catalyst for a revolution or something like that. It just seems to like work so well. I don't think there would have been any other, like, if she was a soccer player or something like that. Like, would that have worked? Like, it was like, it seemed like ballerina was uniquely and
temporal.
Well, it makes sense. That's the thing that she would be doing to kind of recover, to help rediscover her identity, sort of thing. You know what I mean? Like, that was when they were trying to help her redevelop her speech. That's when she went and took dancing lessons. And I think that is a really clever way to tie into the connection. The whoever's up top is controlling the bottom. I think that's a very unique thing. Not everyone dances, right? Like not everyone does it. It's a very small group of people who do that. So before we close out the show, let's go ahead and make some media recommendations. So Daniel, what would you like to throw out there for us today?
If you have 20 minutes to read something, go online and read Junji Ito's The Hanging Balloons. It's a short manga about balloons that have the heads of people that are giant, and they have nooses on them. And the only thing that they do is they find the person whose head is identical to theirs, and they try to hang them. Kind of in a way not too distant from Us. I feel like there's somewhat of a similarity. I don't think Junji Ito's cultural criticism was probably quite as refined as Peele's is, but still an easy...
That sounds fantastic.
Yeah, supplemental thing.
I want to read that.
Dive into. No, it is. I like it a lot. But
all right. Anyone else have any other alternate media recommendations?
I've read so many books, and I know there's one on the tip of my tongue that deals with doppelgangers, but I can't think of it now, so no, I have nothing.
Okay. I say watch Persona.
Yeah, there you go.
Watch Persona, absolutely.
I say watch Denis Villeneuve's Enemy, because it's great, and it's also going to leave you like with your head scratching your head at the end of the movie, thinking about it for days. It's great. All right. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for joining the show today. LaRon Chapman, is there anywhere else people can keep up with you online?
Again, you can follow me and my film at Freaky AF Film on Twitter, Instagram, and on Facebook at facebook.com/Freaky AF Film.
All right, Christopher Shultz.
Just go to my website, ChristopherSchultz.com, and I'll be having a lot more Us content coming out from Lit Reactor, where I do a lot of writing, as well as Ranker, where I do a lot of writing. And so, yeah, be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, and of course, check out Christopher's full review on the cinematropolis.com if you enjoyed kind of the things we talked about on the show today. It's a good read. You can knock it out like on a lunch break or something really quick, so I highly recommend. Daniel Bowkemper, where can people keep up with you online?
First and foremost, the Cinematropolis, and also just Google Bowkemper, spell it the best you can, and you'll probably find me.
All right, and of course you can find me tweeting about all sorts of things on Twitter at CMastersTalk. That's letter C Masters Talk, and you can find the Cinematropolis on Twitter and Instagram at the Cinematrop, or on Facebook at facebook.com/the Cinematropolis. All right, everyone, thanks so much for joining our special review of Us. We'll catch you again next time.